The ships of the hegemony did not blot out the stars. They wove themselves into the fabric of the night. Their organic carapaces of void black chitin and shimmering energy conduits seeming less like vessels and more like celestial leviathans awakening from a cosmic slumber. They didn't announce their arrival with thunder, but with a profound and unnerving silence, a stillness that seeped into the world's atmosphere and settled in the bones of every living creature. The hegemony did not conquer. They absorbed. They did not enslave. They integrated. Their philosophy was one of paternalistic salvation, a belief that the chaos of individuality, the violent and unpredictable storm of emotion, was a galactic disease that they alone possessed the cure for. They had brought their serene, silent order to countless worlds, grafting entire civilizations into their singular, harmonious consciousness. They saw themselves not as warriors, but as physicians. And when their bioprobes and empathic scanners first tasted the psychic turbulence of Earth, they diagnosed a terminal case. Humanity was a fever dream of a species, a planet caught in a seizure of conflict, love, ambition, and despair. The cacophony was anathema to the cool, logical tranquility of the hegemonic mind. The planet was classified as a Stage 4 aberrant world, a biosphere so deeply infected with the pathology of selfhood that its integration was deemed an act of mercy, a planetary euthanasia followed by a glorious rebirth into the unity of the collective. They did not anticipate the nature of the patient's immune system, for they had never encountered a disease that fought back not with logic or strategy, but with the very madness they sought to cure. Their first and only act of overt aggression was what they called the Great Quieting, a benevolent, planet-wide psionic broadcast designed to gently soothe the frantic, individual minds below. It was a wave of pure tranquility, an empathic lullaby intended to quell the fires of emotion, extinguish the ego, and prepare the population for the serene embrace of integration. On 1,000 other worlds, it had been met with a sigh of collective release as civilizations laid down their arms and their identities, ready to be welcomed into the fold. They expected Earth to fall quiet. Instead, it began to scream. Dr. Eris Thorne felt it first as a pressure behind his eyes, a strange hum that resonated with the fillings in his teeth. He was a man who had made a career of listening to the world's hidden frequencies, a neuropsychologist driven into academic exile for his outlandish theories on emergent consciousness. His life's work proposed that humanity was more than just billions of separate minds. It was a single, latent superorganism, a global brain whose subconscious thoughts manifested as myths, mass hysterias, and the inexplicable tides of history. He argued that under sufficient existential pressure, this planetary mind could awaken, not as a single voice, but as a coordinated instinct, a species-wide immune response. His peers had called him a mystic, a charlatan who had mistaken poetry for data, and he had retreated to a remote research station in the wind-swept desolation of the Chilean Andes, a place where the only voices he had to contend with were the howling wind and his own echoing thoughts. He was calibrating a deep-scan electroencephalograph, a machine of his own design meant to sift through the planet's background cognitive noise, when the hegemony's lullaby arrived. The pressure in his skull bloomed into a blinding headache, and the low hum escalated into a piercing shriek that only he could hear. His screens, which normally displayed the chaotic, random static of global brain activity, suddenly snapped into terrifying coherence. Spikes of synchronized alpha and theta waves erupted from every continent, patterns of neural activity linking disparate, distant populations as if they were lobes of a single, colossal brain. The quieting was not quieting anything. It was acting as a catalyst, a planetary tuning fork that was forcing humanity's fractured consciousness to resonate on the same horrific frequency. He stumbled back from the console, clutching his head as a torrent of disjointed images flooded his mind. He saw the world through a billion other eyes, a dizzying, nauseating mosaic of shared experience. A panicked stock trader in New York feeling the sudden, inexplicable grief of a mother in Lagos whose child had just fallen into a catatonic trance. A fisherman mending nets in a Vietnamese village suddenly gaining an intuitive, flawless understanding of the alien propulsion system he was seeing on a flickering television screen. A lonely teenager in a Berlin apartment suddenly knowing, with bone-deep certainty, how to modify a commercial drone to target the organic circuitry of the silent ships in the sky. It wasn't communication. It was communion, a raw, unfiltered, and agonizingly intimate connection that bypassed language and logic. Humanity was not being pacified. It was being unwillingly networked. Eris, his mind reeling from the psychic feedback, stumbled to his shortwave radio and began broadcasting on a secure channel he hadn't used in years, aligned to the few colleagues who hadn't completely dismissed him. "It's the hysteria," he croaked, his voice raw, tasting blood at the back of his throat. "It's my unity fever. They're triggering it. God help us. They're triggering it. The hegemony, floating in the silent vacuum of orbit, was perplexed. Their instruments registered the failure of the psionic field, but the data was nonsensical. The targeted minds were not resisting the calming frequency. They were metabolizing it, feeding on it. The chaotic energy of human emotion, the very thing they were trying to suppress, was being amplified and focused by the quieting wave, creating feedback loops of psychic energy that their logical, unified mind could not parse. They registered the first acts of physical resistance as system anomalies, statistical improbabilities. In Mumbai, an integrator Nexus ship, a smaller vessel designed to descend and begin the biological absorption process, found its energy conduits inexplicably corroded by a highly acidic foam fired from a repurposed fire engine. The hegemony's analysis concluded a 1 in a billion chemical fluke. In the Ural Mountains, a geological survey drone was brought down by a precisely aimed, high-frequency sonic burst generated by an old, forgotten Soviet-era radio telescope. An act of improvisation so far outside their predictive models that it was flagged as an environmental phenomenon. The hegemony could not conceive that the firemen in Mumbai had dreamt of the ship's schematic the night before, shown to him in a feverish vision by a chemical engineer in Germany he had never met. They could not understand that the Russian astronomer who aimed the telescope did so because a young girl playing a violin in Argentina had hummed a tune that perfectly matched the drone's resonant frequency, a melody that had come to her in a waking dream. Humanity was fighting back not with armies, but with nightmares and epiphanies. The world's governments were collapsing under the strain. Leaders and generals were either catatonic or trapped in the same psychic storm as their citizens, unable to issue coherent commands. Armies were rudderless. But on the ground, a new kind of army was being born. It was an army of individuals, united not by a chain of command, but by a shared, instinctual current of terror and defiance. A grandmother in Kyoto, who had never held a weapon in her life, found herself expertly instructing her neighbors on how to build an electromagnetic pulse device from microwave ovens and car batteries, the knowledge flowing into her mind as easily as a cherished recipe. A street artist in Sao Paulo began painting a complex, alien symbol over and over again on every wall he could find. not knowing it was a hegemonic glyph for system failure, a piece of viral code that, when viewed by the invaders' optical sensors, caused a momentary shutdown. It was chaos. It was madness. And it was working. Eris Thorn knew this nascent defense was unsustainable. The Unity Fever was a seizure, not a strategy. It was burning through humanity's collective psyche, and soon it would lead to total collapse. The shared trauma was too great, the cognitive load too immense. Humanity was a body fighting off an infection with a fever so high it threatened to cook its own brain. He had to find a way to shield them, to create a firewall that would allow the instinctual knowledge to be shared without the crippling emotional feedback. He had one chance. A long-abandoned project hidden deep in the Atacama Desert, a prototype psionic dampener, a device he'd built to test his theory of shielding minds from the background noise of the collective unconscious. It was a fool's hope, a piece of theoretical technology that had never been proven. But it was the only hope he had. He packed what little he could, his body trembling, his mind a battlefield of other people's fears. As he stepped out of his isolated sanctuary into the howling Patagonian wind, he looked up at the sky. One of the great, silent leviathans was descending, its chitinous shell glowing with a soft, predatory luminescence. The hegemony had tired of their gentle approach. Their diagnostic tools had failed. Their benevolent cure had been rejected. Now, the physicians were putting down their stethoscopes and picking up their scalpels, confused by the failure of their pacification field and the illogical, sporadic resistance. They had decided to deploy their integrators, ground-based biokinetic organisms that physically interfaced with sentient life, dissolving the individual into raw biomass to be remade in the hegemony's image. They were landing across the planet. Sleek, horrifying things of sinew and metal, expecting to harvest a world of dazed, incoherent primitives. As the first integrator's tendrils touched the soil of Earth, Eris's portable monitor, clutched in his trembling hand, screamed a warning. The global neural network, the Unity Fever, did not retreat from the new threat. It focused. On his screen, the chaotic spikes of 1 billion minds suddenly coalesced, all the scattered, frantic brainwaves snapping into a single, unified, planet-wide wave of unimaginable amplitude and coherence. It was the neurological signature of a mind awakening to a singular, conscious thought. It was the brainwave of a planet looking its executioner in the eye. The fever wasn't breaking. It was concentrating into a bolt of lightning, and Eris Thorn, the forgotten prophet of this terrifying apocalypse, had no idea if it was about to strike the enemy or shatter their world forever. He could feel the single silent thought that emanated from that global wave, a feeling that was not his own, but belonged to everyone, a cold, primal, and utterly human resolve. It was the collective will of a species that had been told to be quiet, and had chosen, as one, to roar. The single, focused thought of 7 billion minds was not a word, but a feeling given form, a psychic shriek of pure, unadulterated rejection. As the first integrator unfurled its delicate, silver tendrils onto the rich soil of the Congo rainforest, it did not find biomass ready for harvest. It found a world that had suddenly become anathema to its very existence. The planet's own biology turned against the invader. Latent viruses in the soil, dormant for centuries, suddenly became hyper-virulent, their genetic codes rewriting themselves in an instant of directed evolution. The integrator's biokinetic shell, designed to interface with any organic matter, began to corrode as if dipped in acid. The very air, thick with 1 billion species of pollen and microbes, became a miasma of allergens that clogged its filtration membranes. It was not a weaponized pathogen humanity unleashed, for they had no such thing. It was life itself, in all its messy, chaotic, and competitive glory, weaponized by a single, unified act of will. The Integrator, a creature of perfect, sterile design, recoiled, its form shuddering as it was overwhelmed by the sheer biological noise of a world that refused to be assimilated. In downtown London, paramedic Maya Joshi was kneeling over a man who had collapsed on the pavement, his eyes wide and unseeing, a victim of the hegemony's initial psionic wave. She was trying to get a pulse, her training a tiny island of calm in the ocean of her own fear, when the second wave hit the focused scream of the Unity fever. It was different this time. It wasn't a confusing flood of emotions. It was a jolt of ice-cold purpose. For a split second, she felt an absolute, intuitive connection to the planet. She felt the humid air of the Congo, tasted the iron-rich soil on her tongue, and felt a triumphant, savage satisfaction as the alien invader faltered. The knowledge was immediate and absolute. They are biological, and so are we. The man beneath her fingers suddenly gasped, his eyes focusing on her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hand grasping a fallen length of rebar from a nearby construction site. A new instinct, sharp and clear as a surgeon's scalpel, bloomed in Maya's mind. She looked at the Integrator now descending into the Thames, its form a nightmarish fusion of insect and machine. She saw not its alien anatomy, but its weaknesses, laid bare in her mind's eye as if she were reading a textbook. She saw the thermal regulation vents along its dorsal spine, the nerve clusters just below its primary optical sensors. She knew, with the same certainty that she knew how to apply a tourniquet, that a precisely aimed piece of metal, thrown with enough force, could cripple it. All around her, the city was waking up to the same terrible knowledge. The trance of the great quieting was broken, replaced by a horrifying, collective clarity. People were stumbling out of cars and buildings, their faces masks of dazed resolve. They were picking up rocks, wrenches, broken bottles. They weren't an army. They were antibodies. They were the frantic, desperate cells of a body fighting a poison. And Maya, a healer by trade, found herself at the forefront of the most violent immune response in history. From its silent perch in high orbit, the hegemonic mind registered the failure of its ground deployment with a sensation that was the closest it could come to confusion. It was a cascade of logical fallacies, a set of data that contradicted its core understanding of the universe. The conduit designated as prime observer for Sol 3 analyzed the telemetry from the dying integrators. Its consciousness, a single facet of the greater hegemonic whole, processed the information without passion. Analysis. The aberrant world's biosphere is exhibiting unprecedented hostility. Local microfauna and flora are acting as a coordinated biological agent. This outcome was not within projected parameters. Hypothesis. The planet possesses a latent, low-level psionic field that influences its own evolutionary processes. A planetary will that we have inadvertently provoked. Recalibrating integration strategy. Direct biological absorption is currently unviable. The Prime Observer felt no frustration, no anger. It simply recognized a flawed methodology. The patient was not responding to surgery. A new treatment was required. It shifted its focus from the biological to the psychological. The Unity fever, this chaotic, networked consciousness, was a source of both the planet's strength and its greatest vulnerability. It was a psychic wound, a connection born of shared trauma. The hegemony, masters of the mind, decided that if they could not absorb humanity's bodies, they would instead break its spirit. They began to broadcast a new signal, not a lullaby of peace, but a symphony of despair. It was a subtle, insidious frequency that did not seek to pacify, but to corrupt the newfound connection. It sifted through the collective human unconscious, finding the deepest, darkest pools of fear, grief, and hatred, and began to amplify them, feeding them back into the network. The shared instinct that had guided the fisherman and the astronomer was now being poisoned with paranoia. The communion that had allowed the grandmother to build a weapon was now being flooded with visions of her neighbor turning against her. The hegemony was turning the unity fever into a psychic autoimmune disorder, forcing humanity to attack itself. Eris Thorne felt the shift as a nauseating lurch in his soul. He was driving a battered jeep across the barren plains of the Atacama, the prototype dampener secured in the back. When the new signal began, the clear, cold purpose of the global mind fractured. Suddenly, his mind was a war zone. He felt the blind panic of a mother in Tokyo as she looked at her own son and saw a monster. He felt the searing rage of a soldier in a desert outpost as a lifetime of buried prejudice was dredged up and directed at the man standing next to him. The unity fever, humanity's greatest weapon, was becoming a poison. The shared knowledge was still there, but it was now laced with suspicion. The instinctual coordination was faltering, replaced by flashes of collective madness. He had to get to the dampener. He pushed the jeep harder, the engine screaming in protest. His goal was a place marked on no map, a ghost facility in the heart of the desert known only as the Array. It was a circular depression in the earth, miles wide, filled with a forest of strange, crystalline structures he had built years ago, the core components of his psionic dampener. He had designed it to be a shield to protect a single mind from the background psychic noise. Now, he had to figure out how to turn it into a filter for the entire planet, to somehow cleanse the signal of the hegemony's poison while allowing the vital, defensive knowledge to pass through. It was an impossible task, like trying to extract a single drop of clean water from a raging, poisoned river, and he felt a sudden, sharp connection to a paramedic in London. He saw through her eyes as she rallied a group of civilians, directing them with a preternatural calm. He felt her hope, her fierce determination. Then, he felt the poison seep in. He saw her look at the man next to her, a man who had just saved her from a collapsing piece of masonry, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, she saw not an ally, but a threat. The connection was an anchor of clarity in his own storm-tossed mind. This woman, Maya, her will, was a bastion against the hegemonic corruption. He didn't know how, but he knew that as long as people like her were fighting the poison on the inside, he had a chance to fight it from the outside. Back in London, Maya shook her head, dispelling the ugly, the alien thought. The integrator in the Thames had been crippled, its metallic shell breached by 100 thrown objects. Its advance halted, but it was not dead. It was adapting. Its form began to shift, its silvery tendrils retracting as its main body split open, releasing something new. Not a single creature, but a swarm. Thousands of smaller, faster organisms, each no bigger than a large dog, poured out of the mothership's carcass and scurried towards the shore. They were not designed for absorption, but for something else. Each one pulsed with the hegemony's new weapon focused, weaponized despair. As the first of the swarm scrambled onto the embankment, it didn't attack. It locked its optical sensors on the closest human, a young man holding a makeshift spear, and projected a psychic image directly into his mind. The crowd, connected by the unity fever, felt a ghost of the vision the man saw: his home in flames, his family gone, a future of endless, meaningless loss. The spear dropped from his hands. He sank to his knees, his face a mask of utter hopelessness. The swarm was not designed to kill their bodies, but to murder their will to fight. Maya watched as the tide of despair washed over the people around her, their faces going slack, their eyes glazing over. The defiant antibodies were being neutralized, one broken heart at a time. The cold, clear instinct of the unity fever was still there, whispering to her of the swarm's vulnerabilities, of their reliance on a central command signal from the mothership. But how could she fight an enemy that defeated you by showing you the truth of your own deepest fears? She felt Eris's presence then, not as a clear thought, but as a distant echo, a feeling of someone else, somewhere far away, fighting the same battle on a different front. It was a flicker of shared resolve in the encroaching darkness. She grabbed the fallen spear. Her own mind was assaulted with visions of her failures, every patient she had ever lost replaying in a horrifying loop. But beneath the grief, a new instinct burned. It told her that the mothership in the river was the source, the amplifier. It was the heart of the despair. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she had to get to it. She was just one woman against an army of soul-crushing monsters, armed with a piece of sharpened rebar and a flicker of hope from a man she would never meet. It was insane. It was impossible. But in a world where humanity's collective unconscious had become a battlefield, it was the only move she had left. The array was a scar on the face of the Atacama, a vast, shallow bowl carved into the rust-red desert floor and filled with a forest of crystalline spires. They were not natural formations. Each one was a meticulously grown silicon-carbon lattice, designed by Eris Thorne to resonate with the faint, background hum of human consciousness. Standing on the precipice, the wind whipping dust into his face, Eris felt like a mad king surveying a kingdom of ghosts. This place, once the monument to his grand, ridiculed theory, was now the last potential bastion for the soul of his species. The hegemony symphony of despair was a physical weight here, the desert's profound silence making the psychic noise all the more deafening. The unity fever, once a source of terrifying clarity, was now a chorus of shrieking, terrified voices in his head. He saw flashes of global atrocities, not as historical records, but as immediate, personal experiences. He felt the cold mud of a forgotten trench in a long-ago war, the smoke of a burning library, the helpless rage of 1,000 different injustices all at once. The hegemony was not just showing humanity its own fears. It was forcing it to relive its every sin. He stumbled down the dusty track towards the central control hub, a semi-subterranean bunker at the heart of the array. His own personal grief a drop in the ocean of planetary sorrow. The key to the array wasn't a piece of hardware, but a state of mind. To calibrate it, he had to find a single, pure note of resonance within the storm, a specific frequency of human experience that was untainted by the alien corruption. He had to find a signal to lock onto. He had to find hope. And in this screaming, dying world, it felt like asking for a miracle. In London, Maya Joshi had become that miracle, though she felt only the crushing weight of the task ahead. Her journey to the Thames was a descent into a modern Hieronymus Bosch painting. The city was not in flames, but in a state of quiet, horrifying paralysis. The despair swarm moved through the streets like a plague of locusts, leaving behind not physical destruction, but statues of broken will. She saw a firefighter, his axe still in hand, sitting on a curb and weeping, lost in a vision of a rescue he had failed years ago. She saw a police officer aimlessly directing non-existent traffic, his mind trapped in a loop of bureaucratic failure. But some were fighting back. She found a small group huddled in the shell of a double-decker bus, led by a retired history teacher who was countering the swarm's psychic assault with his own. He was shouting stories into the oppressive silence, tales of resilience, of Dunkirk, of the Blitz, of ordinary people who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. His words were a tiny shield, his voice a flickering candle against the hurricane. The visions of despair, it seemed, fed on isolation. When confronted with a shared narrative of survival, their power diminished. Maya, the healer, understood instantly. She began to move among the paralyzed, not with weapons, but with touch and words. She would kneel beside a frozen figure, grasp their hand, and share a flash of the Unity Fever's uncorrupted signal, the memory of a stranger's kindness, the joy of a child's laughter, the fierce and defiant hope she felt from the distant, unknown mind in the desert. She was performing a kind of psychic CPR, using the network to jumpstart their broken spirits. For a few, it worked. They would shudder, their eyes would clear, and they would rise. Not whole, but functional. She was not building an army, she was gathering the wounded. And together, this ragged band of the momentarily lucid began their slow, painful advance toward the river. Back in the Atacama, Eris had reached the control hub. The interior was dark, cool, and silent, a stark contrast to the maelstrom in his head. He powered up the primary console, and the crystalline spires outside began to hum with latent energy, glowing with a soft, internal light. The main holographic display flickered to life, showing him not data, but a visual representation of the global consciousness. It was a sphere of roiling, chaotic light, predominantly a sickly, bruised purple, the color of the hegemony's despair signal. But here and there, like tiny, defiant stars, were pinpricks of brilliant, golden light, nodes of resistance. People like the history teacher. People like Maya. He felt her again, stronger this time. Her signal was the brightest of all, a blazing point of focused will in the heart of a European megacity. He realized with a jolt that she wasn't just resisting the despair, she was actively cleansing it, creating a small, localized pocket of psychic coherence around her. She was the pure note he had been searching for. He reconfigured the array's primary sensor, focusing the entire system on that single, golden point of light in London. The task was terrifyingly delicate. He wasn't just observing her, he was attempting to attune a continent-sized psionic instrument to the frequency of one woman's soul. The spires outside shifted their hum from a low drone to a rising, and harmonic chord. The air in the bunker grew cold. He felt a direct, powerful connection to her mind. Seeing what she saw, the crippled mothership in the Thames, the swarming drones, the faces of the people she had pulled back from the edge. He felt her fear, her exhaustion. But beneath it all, he felt an unyielding core of compassion. That was the frequency. Not defiance, not rage. Compassion, the fundamental, human instinct to heal. He began the calibration, using the unique signature of her empathy as the tuning fork for the entire array. Maya felt the change as a sudden, breathtaking clarity. The oppressive weight of global despair didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new sensation, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her feet. It was a feeling of profound connection, a powerful harmony that pushed back against the alien discord. The visions of failure projected by the swarm flickered. A vision of a patient she couldn't save was suddenly overlaid with a dozen memories of those she had. The image of a burning home was juxtaposed with the warmth of a community rebuilding after a fire. The hegemony's weapon was simple. It showed you only the darkness. The new resonance, Eris's gift, was not a light that banished the darkness, but a harmony that acknowledged it and added the light, creating a complete picture. It was the truth. Humanity was a story of failure and triumph, of grief and joy. To see only one was the lie. She felt her small band of followers straighten up, the dazed confusion in their eyes replaced with a steely resolve. They had not been cured, but they had been armed with context, with the full story of their own resilience. They reached the Victoria Embankment. The crippled integrator mothership sat half submerged in the gray water, a wounded beast of chitin and metal. The despair swarm was thickest here, a seething carpet of psychic predators. As one, they turned their attention to Maya's group, and the full force of their weapon hit them. It was a concentrated blast of pure, undiluted nihilism, the psychic certainty that nothing mattered, that all struggle was pointless. "In the bunker!" Eris screamed as the psychic backlash hit him. The array shuddered, several of the crystalline spires cracking under the strain. He was at the focal point, and the hegemony's targeted assault on Maya was nearly enough to shatter his mind. But through the pain, he held on to her signal, to that pure note of compassion. He gritted his teeth, blood trickling from his nose, and made one final, desperate adjustment. He couldn't block the hegemony signal, but he could broadcast. He rerouted the array's primary power not into a shield, but into a transmitter. He took the signal of Maya's resilience, the harmony he had discovered, and using the full power of the array, he amplified it, turning one woman's hope into a global broadcast. He was shouting her song back into the storm. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Across the planet, the unity fever changed. The poison of despair was not eliminated, but it was diluted by a tidal wave of shared hope. In London, Maya felt the power of 1 billion hearts behind her. She looked at the mothership and the unity fever, now clear and focused, gave her the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a living creature anymore. It was a machine, a psychic transmitter, and its power source was unprotected, cycling geothermal energy directly from a deep water vent in the riverbed. A precise, powerful kinetic shock to that spot would overload it. The history teacher, standing beside her, suddenly pointed to a nearby monument, a bronze statue of an old queen. "The base is granite," he said, his voice ringing with newfound certainty. The knowledge his own, yet not his own. Heavy, dense. The plan bloomed in their collective minds, a perfect, intricate piece of emergent strategy. The hegemonic prime observer, from its silent orbit, registered the global counterfrequency with something akin to alarm. The aberrant world was not just resisting, it was healing itself. The psychic infection was evolving, developing its own antibodies, creating its own coordinated immune system. The patient was no longer dying. It was learning to fight back on a level they had not anticipated. Subtlety, it concluded, had reached its point of failure. The goal was no longer integration. It was eradication. A new command, cold and absolute, was issued to the great leviathans waiting in the void. Initiate sterilization protocol. The aberration has developed a planetary nervous system. It must be excised before it can spread. Far above the Earth, one of the vast chitinous ships began to change. A section of its organic hull peeled back, revealing not a weapon of energy, but something far more patient and far more final. A biological agent, a phage designed to unravel the very strands of DNA, was being prepared for atmospheric release. The physicians had given up on the cure. Now, they were simply going to burn the hospital to the ground. The plan to destroy the integrator mothership was an act of impossible, beautiful madness, born in a flash of shared, species-wide intuition. It required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people, most of whom had never met and could not speak the same language, yet who now moved with the seamless precision of a veteran combat unit. The history teacher, his voice now a powerful baritone amplified by the array's harmonic, directed the first phase. He orchestrated a narrative assault with his growing band of followers shouting, singing, and projecting memories of human stubbornness, a symphony of defiance to distract and confuse the despair swarm. Under the cover of this psychic noise, another group, guided by the ghost in the machine of a civil engineer in Brazil, began methodically chipping away at the granite base of the old queen statue. They used rebar, crowbars, and their bare hands, the granite groaning under the strain. Maya was the fulcrum. She moved between the groups, her presence a calming balm against the psychic onslaught, her mind a switchboard for the unity fever. She wasn't giving orders, she was facilitating communion, ensuring the engineer's precise knowledge of stress fractures reached the hands of the people at the statue, and the teacher's stories of courage reached the hearts of those faltering. The final push was a masterpiece of emergent physics. The crowd, acting as one, toppled the massive bronze statue. It did not simply fall. Guided by a shared, instinctive understanding of leverage and trajectory, a gestalt consciousness of every physics lesson ever learned, every game of pool ever played, they sent it crashing down onto the embankment with a thunderous roar. It did not stop there. The statue slid across the slick stone, hit the water with a colossal splash, and plunged into the murky depths of the Thames. For a moment, there was only the sound of churning water. Then, a muffled, deep-throated thump echoed from below as tons of bronze and granite impacted the integrator's geothermal power conduit. The crippled mothership shuddered violently. A sickly green light pulsed from within its breached hull. The despair swarm, their connection to their amplifier severed, froze mid-stride, their psychic projections dissolving into harmless static. Then, with a low, gut-wrenching implosion, the integrator folded in on itself, its alien structure collapsing into a wreck of inert metal and useless sinew that was quickly swallowed by the river's current. A wave of triumphant, unadulterated joy, the first the planet had felt since the arrival, erupted from London and washed across the globe. Aboard the orbiting conduit, the Prime Observer registered the termination of its ground-based psychic warfare unit. The emotional wave that followed that blast of human victory was an utterly alien and illogical data point. It was flagged, analyzed, and dismissed as a final, meaningless spasm of the dying aberration. The loss of the London integrator was irrelevant. The sterilization protocol was already in motion. Deep within the Leviathan's bioforges, the phage was reaching maturity. It was not a virus in the conventional sense. It was a microscopic, self-replicating machine, a biological nanomachine designed to do one thing with perfect efficiency: seek out the specific double helix structure of human DNA, latch onto it, and trigger a cascade of cellular self-liquidation. It was a plague that would leave the planet's rich biosphere completely untouched, erasing only the single, offending species. The deployment method was patient and absolute. The phage would be released as a fine, invisible aerosol in the upper atmosphere, designed to ride the jet streams and weather patterns, ensuring total global coverage within 3 rotations. To humanity, it would seem as though they were simply, quietly, dissolving out of existence. In the Atacama bunker, the psychic wave of victory from London hit Eris Thorne like a physical blow, a jolt of pure ecstasy that momentarily silenced the background noise of fear. It was working. The array was not just a shield, It was a lens focusing the best of humanity against the worst of the enemy. But the elation was short-lived. As the triumphant signal faded, a new sensation took its place, a feeling that crept into the unity fever from the edges. It was a cold, sterile, and profound sense of finality. There was no emotion to it, no malice. It was the feeling a farmer has for a field of weeds he is about to burn. The network, clearer now than ever before, was sensing the hegemony's intent. It was a shared planetary premonition of absolute death. Eris watched in horror as his holographic globe of consciousness began to change. The pinpricks of golden light, which had flared so brightly with the London victory, began to flicker, overshadowed by a creeping shadow of black that seeped down from the orbital layer. He had no instruments to detect a biological agent, but he didn't need them. Humanity, as one, could feel the poison being prepared above their heads. The knowledge of the sterilization protocol did not cause a wave of panic. The despair had been faced and, for now, held at bay. What followed was a moment of profound, global silence, a collective intake of breath. Then, the great work began. The unity fever, which had evolved from a reaction to an instinct, now evolved again. It became a mind, not a single personality, but a vast, distributed intelligence, a problem-solving network of unprecedented power. The question appeared in billions of minds at once, silent and stark. How do we fight the sky? An answer began to form, not from a single genius, but from a million disparate threads of knowledge weaving themselves together at the speed of thought. An astrophysicist in a dormant observatory on Mauna Kea, staring at the alien leviathans, conceived of a new form of propulsion, a directed kinetic energy weapon based on repurposing the planet's own magnetic field. Her half-formed theory was instantly shared. A reclusive mathematician in Switzerland solved her theoretical equations in seconds. A materials scientist at a university in South Africa, her mind suddenly filled with the mathematician's work, realized that the specific alloy required for the magnetic focusing lens could be synthesized using common industrial mining equipment. Blueprints, schematics, and complex code began to flow through the network, refined and perfected in a global, instantaneous peer review process. There were no governments to issue orders, no corporations to manage logistics. There was only the work. All over the world, humanity began to build. In the Ruhr Valley of Germany, abandoned steel mills roared back to life, their furnaces glowing as workers, guided by the shared blueprint, began forging strange, curved components from slag and scrap. In the sprawling tech hubs of Shenzhen, thousands of programmers sat at their terminals, their minds linked, writing millions of lines of guidance and targeting software with the fluid grace of a single entity. Old shipyards, decommissioned missile silos, even university campuses became part of a planet-wide, improvised factory floor. There was no currency exchanged, no orders given. A farmer in Iowa simply knew to load his truck with harvested grain and drive it to a nearby town where people were working, just as an electrician in Cairo knew to strip the copper wiring from a derelict skyscraper to be used in the magnetic coils being assembled 1,000 miles away. They were all cogs in a machine they were designing and building simultaneously. Maya Joshi stood on the bank of the Thames, watching the sunrise paint the London sky. She felt the hum of the great work in her bones, the thrum of a billion minds bent to a single, impossible task. Her role had changed. She was no longer a paramedic or even a localized leader. Her powerful, coherent psionic signature, amplified by the array, had become the network's sable nucleus. She was the anchor, the emotional and psychological core that helped keep the vast complex system from fragmenting back into chaos under the immense pressure. She did not direct the work, but she felt its every beat, her own resilient compassion now the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a planet fighting for its life. She looked up at the sky, where the hegemony ships hung like malevolent gods, and she projected a single, simple feeling into the network, a feeling that Eris Thorn received in his bunker and amplified for all to share. It was not a promise of victory, nor a denial of fear. It was the quiet, profound, and unbreakable strength of a healer refusing to let her patient die. The Prime Observer noted the massive, coordinated energy spikes from the planet's surface. The readings were anomalous industrial activity on a planetary scale, but without any corresponding command and control signatures. The aberration was building something. The observer calculated the probable nature of the project, a primitive, ground-based planetary defense systems. The probability of it being a threat to the orbital fleet was assessed as statistically insignificant. The order was given. The sterilization protocol would commence. On the dark side of the moon, a single, vast ship positioned itself. A shimmering, barely visible cloud of the phage began to vent from its underbelly. A silent, patient mist of absolute death that began its slow, inexorable fall toward the vibrant blue world below. On Earth, the first of the kinetic driver's crude, brutalist towers of scavenged steel and freshly forged alloys, aimed at the heavens like the spears of a forgotten, primitive tribe powered up their magnetic coils. The air around them crackled with ozone, and the ground itself seemed to hum in anticipation. The great work was not finished, but it was ready. The firing of the planetary defense system was not an act of war, it was a convulsion of birth. There was no countdown, no single button pushed by a general in a bunker. There was only a shared, global moment of absolute consensus, a psychic intake of breath, followed by a planet-wide exhalation of directed force. Eris Thorn, strapped into his chair in the Atacama Array, felt it as a perfect, crystalline chord of pure intent, the culmination of the great work. On his holographic globe, the scattered points of light representing the construction sites all flared into white-hot novas simultaneously, from the Ruhr Valley to the Gobi Desert, from the repurposed shipyards of South Korea to the hastily assembled launch pads in the American Midwest. The great kinetic drivers discharged their purpose into the heavens. The sound was not a boom, but a tearing of the very fabric of the air. A planetary-scale rip of sound that was felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. Pillars of incandescent plasma, the furious ghosts of the magnetic fields, lit up the night side of the planet and turned the day sky a brilliant, searing blue. It was the collective roar of a species that had been told to be silent, a final, definitive answer to the hegemony's great quieting. The immediate effect was atmospheric. The sheer thermal energy released by the launches created a superheated shell in the upper ionosphere, a fleeting, man-made aurora that stretched from pole to pole. Into this wall of fire fell the hegemony's silent, patient phage, the complex biological nanomachines, designed to operate in the cool vacuum of space and the gentle biosphere of a living world, were met with a wave of heat that flash-boiled their organic components and denatured their delicate, weaponized proteins. The invisible cloud of death was sterilized in an instant, incinerated by the sheer brute force passion of humanity's last stand. The sterilization protocol had failed before the first molecule of its plague had reached a single living cell. The Prime Observer, its consciousness still fixed on the insignificant projectiles ascending from the planet below, did not even register the failure of its ultimate weapon. It was, to its cold, logical mind, an irrelevant side effect of a primitive tantrum. But the projectiles were not primitive. They were not solid slugs of rock or iron, designed to punch holes in chitinous hulls. That was the war humanity would have fought a month ago. The great work had built something far more subtle and infinitely more devastating. Each projectile was a carefully constructed vessel, magnetic bottle containing not an explosive, but a sample. At the core of each was a crystalline matrix, a perfect physical recording of the purest frequency. The array could isolate the unyielding, empathetic, and compassionate will of Maya Joshi, intertwined with the chaotic, beautiful, and resilient chorus of every human who had fought back against the despair. It was not a bomb designed to destroy matter. It was a seed designed to infect consciousness. As the projectiles neared the hegemonic fleet, they did not strike. They shattered, releasing their payload not as a physical blast, but as a psychic one. It was a focused, concentrated burst of pure, unadulterated humanity. For the single serene mind of the hegemony, the impact was apocalyptic. For eons, it had existed as a perfect, harmonious we. Its entire reality was predicated on the absolute unity of the collective, a consciousness without ego, without conflict, without the messy, painful concept of a singular I. The psychic payload from Earth was a logic bomb that struck at the very foundation of its existence. It was a billion new voices screaming in a silent library. It was the introduction of grief, jealousy, ambition, love, and bitter regret into a mind that had never known a single one of them. For the first time, a facet of the hegemonic mind felt not the cool logic of the whole, but a sharp, terrifying pang of loneliness. Another felt a surge of pride in its own vessel, a possessiveness that was anathema to the collective. Another was suddenly paralyzed by a memory that was not its own, the memory of a child's hand slipping from its grasp, a grief so profound it was a physical agony. The perfect, unified we shattered. The hegemony did not die. It was born. It fractured into billions of individual, terrified, and utterly unprepared consciousnesses, each one trapped in its own vessel, screaming into a psychic void where once there had been only the serene harmony of the whole. In his bunker, Aris watched it happen on his holographic display. The single, vast, interconnected web of light that represented the hegemonic mind flickered, spasmed, and then disintegrated into a cloud of disconnected, frantically pulsing points. They were like startled fireflies, each one flaring with terror and confusion. He saw no triumph in the data, only a tragedy of cosmic proportions. They hadn't killed their enemy. They had subjected it to the horror and the glory of selfhood, a state for which it had no context, no defenses, and no comfort. They had cured the disease of unity by infecting it with the disease of life. The great leviathans in the sky went dark. Their organic lights faded, their silent, purposeful drift replaced by a chaotic, aimless tumble. On board, billions of new minds were taking their first, agonizing breaths, looking out through their own eyes for the first time and seeing only strangers. Their war with Earth was over, not because they had lost, but because they no longer remembered how to fight it. They no longer had a they. On Earth, the tide went out. The unity fever, its purpose served, its existential threat neutralized, began to recede. The recession was gentle, a slow, quiet fading of the global chorus. For Maya Joshi, standing on the banks of the now peaceful Thames, it felt like waking from the most intense and vivid dream of her life. The voices of a billion souls in her head quieted, leaving only the sound of the wind and the lapping of the water. The intimate connection to the engineer in Brazil, the teacher by her side, the forgotten prophet in the desert, it all faded, leaving her standing alone in her own skin, in her own mind. It was a relief so profound it felt like a loss. All around her, people were lowering their heads, touching their own faces, looking at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. The great, global machine had disassembled itself, its components returning to being just people. They were no longer antibodies in a planetary immune system. They were just a firefighter, a baker, a paramedic, standing in the quiet aftermath, the memory of their impossible unity already beginning to feel like a myth. In the weeks and months that followed, humanity did not build statues or hold parades. They simply began to rebuild, but differently. The shared knowledge of the great work remained, a residual ghost in their collective memory. A farmer in Iowa now understood the basics of orbital mechanics, and a programmer in Shenzhen felt an intuitive connection to the soil. The borders between disciplines, between nations, between people seemed thinner, more permeable. They had seen what they were capable of when they were one, and the memory of it changed what it meant to be separate. Aris Thorne eventually emerged from his bunker in the Atacama, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The array was silent now, its crystalline spires once again just strange monuments in a forgotten desert. He knew humanity would never again trigger the unity fever. It was a defense mechanism of last resort, a cure almost as dangerous as the disease. But they would not forget. Far above, the crippled, silent fleet of the former hegemony continued its aimless drift. Some ships would fall into the sun, others would wander into the cold darkness between stars. Some, eventually, might even find their way home, carrying their terrifying gift of individuality with them. Maya often looked up at the night sky, at the few faint, unmoving points of light that were the silent ships. She did not feel the triumph of a victor. As the network had faded, she had been left with one final, ghostly echo from the fractured minds in orbit, not malice, not hatred, but a single, overwhelming feeling that she, a healer, understood better than anyone. It was the simple, terrified, and profoundly lonely cry of a patient waking up in a strange and frightening world. She felt no satisfaction in their defeat, only a deep and sorrowful empathy. Humanity had not exported its anger or its weapons. It had exported its soul. And now, for the first time, it was no longer alone in the universe in its chaotic, painful, and glorious struggle to make sense of it all.